Hi everyone. This week in Chapter 5 we're looking at values and attitudes at work. So the brief overview this week is that we're going to look at the different kinds of values, how they relate to work, and attitudes and the different kinds of workplace attitudes and how that relates to work as well. So let's start out with the notion of what values are. Well, the most important thing to remember, I think, is that they're fairly stable and they're long-lasting beliefs and feelings that involve judgment, and values, of course, can differ across cultures. So they're important for us because in the workplace they influence our perceptions and our decision making and thus our behavior in organizations. So they influence our attitudes and our behaviors. So some kinds of values, the most basic ones are our personal values. What kind of personal values do we have? What do we value? We might value hard work. We might value our family. We might value honesty. Those would be examples of personal values that we have. But what shapes our values? Where do we get them? Who influences what our values are? So those are some questions to think about for a moment, and I think it's pretty clear that we can think that our peers, our parents, our teachers, our religions, our churches, our schools, anything that we come into contact, social media influences our values. So to get into some of the types of values, we have terminal versus instrumental values, which we talk about in this particular chapter. And I should say that in the chapter I deviate a little bit from what is covered in the text and I add to it. So you might see some different things. So you are responsible for what's here as before and what is in the text as well. So terminal values would refer to a desired end state that we would hope to achieve. So we might want to have the end state of happiness, for example. So the instrumental value refers to the means by achieving the terminal values. So by being cheerful, we would have an example of an instrumental value that would help us achieve the terminal value of happiness. There are examples of that in the text as well. Ethical values, what's right or wrong, what good or bad outcomes are. So it's the study of moral principles or values that determine these factors. So we have examples of those in the chapter as well. Organizational or corporate values. A lot of organizations have mission statements that reflect the values that the organization have. So these values tend to typically reflect the culture of the organization or how the organization does business. So if you go into a shop, you go into an organization, even into fast food restaurants, you might see something framed on the wall that says, at Company X, we value our employees, we value our environment. These would be examples of corporate values. Breaking them down, the values could be the espoused values, so types of corporate values. We value the environment, for example. That would be an espoused value of the organization. So it's what the organization wishes to share, to say that this is what we believe in, and that would be espoused, whereas an enacted value would reflect the organizational norms or how these values, these espoused values, are translated and enacted within the organization. So we might say we value the environment, yet we find that the organization's lunchroom has styrofoam coffee mugs. So that would be an enacted value, for example. The organization, the example I give you in the PowerPoints is that the organization values the employee, but then it cuts back on hiring and sets higher benchmarks for them. So that would be espoused versus enacted values, what they say they're doing, and in fact what they end up doing, the way things are actually around the organization. I give you some examples of Facebook's values on the PowerPoints, which you can take a look at. The other category of values that we look at are societal values. So what are the different values according to different societies. So I have given you example of Canadian and US values. How do they differ? And the example that I have here gives several different sets of values. But for example, a good one is that in Canada we value multiculturalism, respect for cultural differences. Whereas in America, the same set of values would be the melting pot, where society looks at a homogeneous society or assimilation into a common culture. So that would be different societal values between Canada and the US. The next set of values we look at are cross-cultural values, according to Geert Hofstede, who did a study in 1980 where he surveyed about 116,000 IBM employees across different countries. He chose IBM because they had a broad range of offices internationally to study from, and he narrowed down 5 or 6 sets of values that he said accounted for cross-cultural differences across different orientations and different cultures. And out of all those values, as I say, he came up with 5 sets, and some of them are talked about in the PowerPoints, which you should know, the collectivism versus individualism values. So how much individuals identify themselves by group membership, how much group harmony is important, so that would be a high degree of collectivism, versus individualism, or the extent that we value personal uniqueness. So there are some examples, certainly not all countries, but I've given you some examples of how some countries place on these different scales, whether they have high collectivism or high individualism. And we can think in terms of what that would mean. For example, if a country had a high sense of collectivism, and in the chart we have China scores very high on collectivism. So if we were a multinational operating within China, it probably wouldn't work too well if we were to single out employees individually. So rewarding individuals rather than team membership would have an impact in depending on whether you were a more collective or individualist society. Likewise, power distance is another dimension that Hofstede looks at. High power dimension, the power distance refers to how comfortable people are with unequal distribution of power. So if a country has a high power distance, there's going to be polarized superior-subordinate relationships. If a country has a low power distance, equal sharing is expected, and problems and issues are resolved through coalitions. So Canada is towards the low power distance. On this, Germany is lower than Canada, US is slightly higher. China and India are at the high distance level. So there would be, for example, in Germany, co-determination, where unions are involved in problem solving, would indicate low power distance because conflicts are resolved through coalitions. Where in a country where there was more unequal distribution of power, there would not be as much input, collective sharing of power. Uncertainty avoidance, how well do people tolerate ambiguous situations? So if you have high uncertainty avoidance, it means that rules and structures are valued. So rules and structures are in place, versus low uncertainty avoidance where people are open to innovation. Again, there are scores on, countries are scored on it on the PowerPoints. So that's a very brief overview of values and different kinds of values, and how they take precedence in the workplace and how they impact on our behavior. And then we switch over to attitudes, which are influenced by values because values help shape our attitudes. But attitudes differ from values because attitudes are less stable over time and they can change, whereas we said values were more stable. So we can change our attitudes depending on different situations and different events. And attitudes are judgments that we have on any number of different things that are framed either by our direct exposure or how we've been emotionally conditioned. And they reflect how we feel about people, places, ideas, things. So an attitude could be, I like my job. An attitude can be, and I have an example, and I like think Sunday shopping is wrong, or I think Sunday shopping is right. And that was a big issue in Nova Scotia a few years ago, and it was an attitude that people had about whether or not it was okay to shop on Sunday. I think that smoking in public places should be banned. I think smoking in public places should be allowed. That's an attitude. I don't believe women should work. I believe women should work. That's another attitude. And these attitudes represent our beliefs or our values, in this case, because our values shape our attitudes, and our feelings. So we have an emotional component in there, and our behavioral intentions. So if we have an attitude about something, we will tend to respond or behave in a certain way because of that attitude. So that will affect how we think or how we feel towards people, places, things, and ideas. So in the workplace, values, attitudes, and performance are closely linked, because people bring their attitudes and their values with them to the workplace, and they take them away. So satisfaction and performance are likely higher if an employee's values fit with those of the organization, and subsequently they form the attitudes based on that. So some work-related attitudes that people have are job satisfaction. That's an attitude. It's a collection of attitudes about different facets of the job. For example, pay, working conditions, chances for promotion, the type of work. And commitment is another work-related attitude. An emotional loyalty commitment. Are we emotionally attached to the organization? Do we feel that we identify strongly with the values in the organization? So, for example, a member of a religious community, priest, minister, imam, rabbi, would have a strong sense of loyalty and emotional attachment to the organization, to the church. Or is it an attitude of commitment that looks at whether or not it's a continuous commitment, is what it's called, a non-emotional commitment. So you would still be committed, but it would be the belief that staying with the organization serves your own personal interests. So it's still commitment, but it's non-emotional. So you would feel that maybe you had put in the time in the organization, you had committed, so you'd build up seniority, so your attitude would be non-emotional. How is it influencing your own personal interests? There are different attitudes in organizational performance, so we look at different theories of motivation as job satisfaction models, and equity theory is one of them, which will affect your attitude about the job. So if you feel you're being treated equitably and fairly compared to others, you're more likely to experience good job satisfaction and value your job. So your attitude about your job will be more positive. Expectancy theory looks at how work is directed towards behavior that people will lead to desired outcomes. So expectancy theory, which we get into more in motivation, will explain how attitude and values work. So the notion of the Pygmalion effect, which says that it's related to the notion of self-fulfilling prophecies. So this effect, Pygmalion effect, occurs when high expectations of the manager result in measurable enhancements to performance. So if the manager believes that you can do the job, raises the bar, sets goals, if I believe that if my boss likes me, I will react by working harder and coming to work on time, and that will lead to the outcome that I want, because I know that the bar has been set and I believe that the manager believes in me. What else do I want to tell you in this chapter that I haven't touched on? Oh, we should talk about what happens when behaviors and attitudes clash. So most of the time, our attitudes and our values and our emotions will predict what we'll do. But an exception to the rule is when behavior influences our attitudes. So that means when there's an inconsistency among our beliefs and our attitudes and our behaviors, and this is when what we call cognitive dissonance occurs. So cognitive dissonance is this dissonance, this noise, this disarray that we experience when we catch ourselves saying one thing but doing another, or that we discover that our values are inconsistent with another. So we might be in our job, but we might say that we stay in our job, but we don't like our job. So that would be very upsetting. So we're in the job that we don't like, but we're not leaving it. So the dissonance would be experienced that we're dissatisfied with our job. So we would think that, therefore, we'd go and look for a new job. We don't like our job, we should look for a new job. But what actually happens? For whatever reason, we stay with the job. Maybe the job market isn't very good, and there is no other opportunity out there. So it would be very stressful and very tense if we felt one thing and kept doing something that was contrary to our beliefs. So what happens is that we have to justify this behavior. So over time, we'll start to say that the job is great, or we'll believe that the job is great, and our attitude will change to bring it in line with our beliefs and with our behavior of staying with it. So this is what we call cognitive dissonance. And we can probably look at that and apply it to a number of different situations. I remember a few years ago I had a car that I really liked, but it was a really not a good car. It didn't work. It had every issue possible wrong with it. So I eventually was this car. I had it. I didn't like it over time because it wasn't working, but I held on to it because I couldn't afford to get a new car straight away. So I eventually made allowances for it and said, well, it was a nice color, or it looked good, or it was fine on clear days. It drove well, but I tried to bring my decision to keep the car in line with my belief overall. So just a little humorous example there. Anyway, overall, that's what you should pick up in this chapter. That's what I'm hoping that you'll focus on: the different kinds of values, how they are developed, whether or not they're stable, and values are fairly stable. It's not to say they don't change, but they're more stable than attitudes, which can change over time, as we've just seen with cognitive dissonance, and how they relate into the workplace. So that's what I want you to focus on for this week, and have a great week.